Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final episode. So, first of all, thank you so much for bearing with me because these took a lot longer to release than I had originally planned on. This episode was not really an episode, this was a planning session in which we discussed the topics and questions that I wanted to cover in future episodes. And I hesitated for a long time about releasing this because it wasn't really meant to be released. But Culadasa does give some interesting hints as to his thoughts and what he'd like to say about these different topics. So, in that spirit of Culadasa wanting to always help his students as much as possible and share his knowledge and experience, I thought it would be reasonable to release these. Unfortunately, after this recording, Chiludasa became really unwell and he was not able to continue, and he died a few weeks afterwards. And so it's a real pity because even in the few days before his death, I spoke to him and he was still so excited about doing these, answering these questions, and actually was much more excited about these questions than doing his life chronology, which he thought was not that interesting. And he really wanted to get to these questions and share those. He thought those were much more worthwhile. But really, right up until the end, his concern was with helping his students and being there for them. And I just think he was such a remarkable man. I thank you so much, Chuladasa, because your work has truly changed my life. I know it's changed many other people's lives in so many positive ways. Um, and I feel so grateful and privileged to have been able to do this series with you. We had a lot more to talk about, but that's not how it worked out in the end. So everyone, thank you so much for watching these, and appreciate your patience with me in getting them released. Enjoy, and all the best.
Um, right. Um, yes. So we then the next one was what would you differently with the situation in hindsight? You know, what
Mhm.
to prevent this coming up, which I think you had mentioned that they were um, looking back that you would have wanted to change quite a bit or many things.
Yes. Well, and there's going to be a couple of different categories of answers to this. Is like, what would you do differently with the situation? Um, what might you have might I have done? You know, knowing what I did know at that time.
Right.
And the other is, what might I have done had I known things that I didn't know at that
Yes.
time?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
right.
and I also sort of added in the two categories, they're sort of mundane and spiritually. So, like on a mundane level, one of the things you've mentioned is you would not put your students on the board, for example.
Yes, right.
But on a spiritual, like on a, I don't know, is there something with spiritual, the benefit of spiritual hindsight that you might have done differently?
Yeah,
I
right.
don't know.
Yes. And well, and indeed, that is, yeah, that's a really important question to ask from both of those points of view.
Lovely.
Um, you know, and one of the things that I was aware of is that my ability to uh, provide any useful advice to them as my students
Right.
had disappeared at some point, and I should have done something about that. But
That's an
that's
interesting point because you did mention over the years that people would come to you in interviews, meditation interviews, and they'd say, "Oh, I've reached, third path or this path or whatever, or I'm doing." And you said you didn't bother. You didn't usually try to contradict them or try to change their minds on things. You said they'll figure this out eventually, and that was something that over
Mhm.
the years you thought maybe you should have been a bit more confrontational with people, which is, it's a
Yeah.
difficult thing to do. It's something that I deal with in with clients as well, is sometimes I can see someone's heading off in a totally wrong direction, but is this the time and the place to confront them
Mhm.
with that? It's always a difficult thing. Yeah.
Yes, right.
Um, and then, of course, I really want to start this, of course, with a preamble. I think it's so important, which seems to have been glossed over by most people, is that
Mhm.
the kind of things that you were accused of were quite different from, some of the other big Buddhist scandals, in
Mhm.
that you didn't misuse your students, you didn't abuse your students, you didn't. There's quite some differences, and they were trying to lob you into a different category. So that's something that I want to highlight. Um, but then the whole point of these questions was, if people were sort of disappointed and in doubt, and they were disillusioned, um, because they thought, well, someone who is third or fourth path or whatever, or awakened with 40 years of practice, shouldn't be embroiled in this kind of thing.
Mhm. Yeah, well, what's important about this topic here, I mean, there are two different things that need to be addressed in some ways quite separately from each other. The you know, what is the perception that was created about sexual behavior and what was actually the case, and the impression that was created about uh, misappropriation of funds, and then of course what the real situation was. But quite different aspect of the sexual situation, which I think you address elsewhere, is not only what really did happen as compared to what people might have projected or assumed, or et cetera, and so on. Um, that in terms of what really did happen, why it happened, and how, what my view is on what happened.
Yeah, yeah. Now, like I said, we don't really want to reopen that whole can of worms of, that he said, she said, um,
No,
but we do
there's
want to
something
talk
very
about,
different, that there are things that people may have assumed that nobody ever said,
right,
except other Reddit commentators and things like that. There's a whole version of things, you know, that well, even take the misuse of funds. The only misuse of funds that they ever actually uh, allegation they ever actually made was that I had uh, somehow misused our marital funds. That was
yeah,
the only thing they ever mentioned. Um, Yet there are a very large number of people out there who have talked about it and have made some assumptions that something else was referred to. But the other thing was the biggest factor is when I did release my response to the Sangha, some of the people that originally perpetrated this jumped in and said, well, it wasn't really about sex anyway. It was really about money. And that was the first allegation that they made, that I had somehow misused uh, some funds other than Nancy and my joint funds. Do you recall
right.
that?
Yeah. And you said that they even went and hired forensic accountants and things, and they didn't find anything that
That's right.
you had. So, I think that you have. I mean, I might go and relook at the interview you did with Steve James with Guru Viking, because I think you did address that to some degree in there.
Mhm.
What I feel is more important to talk about from the view of your students is this idea of uh, not being susceptible to the lust and greed of the world once one has
Right.
reached a certain part. And so I think that's
Mhm.
what I think that's what your students are really interested in. The other stuff, they're not
Yeah.
interested in the soap opera aspect
Right.
of it. Right?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yes, that's good.
But if you do want to address that, that's entirely up to you. But as far as I'm concerned, you laid it all out in that document, and you've done that quite in-depth interview with Steve James. So I don't know that there's that much more to say. At this point, people either accept your version of the story or they don't.
Mm-hmm. All right.
But it's entirely up to you. If you still feel there's something that you want to address there, go for
Sure.
it.
Okay.
But I'm not going to dig into that. Let's put it that way.
Okay. All right.
Is that all right, Culadasa?
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would, what people were really interested in was this idea of your narrative, self-making story mind that kind of wasn't working in the same way that people, worldlings experience. That was one thing.
Mhm.
They found that difficult to understand. They found they found it difficult to understand that you could engage in physical relationship with people without there being sensual lust, desire, that sort of
Mhm.
thing going on.
Right.
And I think one of the other things that had come up, which I don't think you've addressed anywhere else really, is this idea of that it might have been bipolar disorder or frontotemporal dementia or something like that, that there might have been something going on
Mhm.
related to your health issues that caused, uncharacteristic behavior changes.
Mhm.
That was another theory that was floated. And it was something that I considered at some point. I said, well, he's been through a lot, and there are certainly illnesses and things that can happen that can radically change a person's behavior.
Mhm.
So
Well,
I now don't think that, but
Mhm. Yes, but I mean, really, your role in this is to, whether you now think that, or if you once thought it, and it's obvious to you that it's a question in a lot of other people's minds, your job is to represent those people and asking your questions so that I can answer those people's questions,
exactly.
regardless of whether or not you think it's the case.
Yeah. Well, and that is exactly why what I've been thinking about is I'm kind of playing a little bit of an Ananda role here, when he would sometimes ask questions of the Buddha that he already knew the answer to or understood, but for the
Mhm.
benefit of other people who
Right.
weren't there. So sometimes I think I'm asking questions and you might be thinking, but hold on, why are you asking that? You should understand that by now. But
No,
there's a reason that I ask sometimes these things.
no, that's what I want and expect.
Yeah.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so there was that. I think there's also the chance then to discuss a little bit about the 5 ranks, which you have
Mhm.
mentioned in passing, but not to any degree of
Mhm.
depth. And also, I would like your opinion on what does happen with people like Yoshi Sasaki Roshi or Chogyam Trungpa or any of those people. What was going on there?
Mhm.
Um,
And that's a very good and very important question to ask,
yeah,
because there was a point, um, there was a point before I had any understanding at all of either what had happened or what people were saying or thinking had happened,
yeah,
where I thought, well, maybe once I come to sort out this all out in my mind, maybe I would understand what Joshu Sasaki Roshi was,
yeah.
what was happening there. But what I discovered is I couldn't find any commonality at all, and
Commonalities.
I'm
Yeah,
no better. I'm no closer to an answer than a whole lot of other people that can only speculate, because
right.
the I thought that was and I do want to explain that, because I
Yeah,
did say that publicly, that perhaps I would be able to um, provide that more explanation. The fact is that the closer I looked, the less
right.
I could see any overlap, and the quality of my answers to those questions wasn't really any any clearer based on my own experience than would anybody else's answer. Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's a totally different situation.
It is,
Yeah.
and that's been my conclusion that I've drawn over months now of talking to you, thinking about this thing, is that your situation and those situations do not mirror each other in
Mhm.
any way that I can see. And the explanation that most people have settled for is this idea of Ken Wilber's model of clean up, grow up, show up, wake
Mhm.
up, that these things are, completely
Orthogonal, yeah,
separate elements of development, which is, I think, really important to talk about that.
right,
So
right.
if your answer is like, I don't know what happened with those people, then that's fair enough. But I think talking about this explanation, which has now been accepted, of the, you know, compassion and wisdom is one thing, and waking up is something different, and, you know, behaving properly is something completely different. I really think that needs your, uh, you need to elucidate that a bit, because a lot of
I
people are
agree.
going with that
Yes.
model.
It creates an opportunity for me to speak to those things, and I really want to and should. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
lovely. So I think those are the big things where that topic is concerned. Uh, and then after that, I sort of, what do people get wrong about awakening? Um,
Mhm.
what is it really? What can it do and not do? Sort of your um, understanding of what is the awakening, what is the mind, what happens in the brain, because that's something you've talked about with us in the computer. Computer, in the classes that we had, was that you said there were certain parts of the brain, the more primitive parts of the brain, that are being affected, or something to that effect.
Yes. Well,
That
basically what changes, and this is a theme that has emerged before and will emerge again, and at some point might be worth addressing more directly as in itself, is yeah, what does change. That would include things like, do emotions disappear, or do
right,
certain kinds of emotions disappear, and these other kinds of brain changes that people might assume, and different kinds of brain changes that people might not occur to them all, or
yeah,
mind changes, I should say, and to be
right.
able to just have an opportunity to distinguish between those.
Yes, exactly. So that's why one of the things that I want to do to start off that part of the discussion is talking about how you define mind, or what the relationship is between the mind and the brain and awakening.
Yeah, and I mean, some of these questions, common questions you have right after that,
Yeah,
tie into that. Will I still want to have sex?
yes,
Well, this is a meaningless question, because what do you mean by want, and what do you mean by have sex? Uh, some people, many people, that statement can only refer to lust. For many other people, there are all kinds of other versions of having sex and of wanting that are very different than that. And so, people talk and think about these things as though they were infinitely simpler than they really
yeah,
are. So
yeah.
that's very good to address.
Yeah, definitely. That's the sort of thing. One of the people said, will my emotions stay the same? Will I still be able to get happy? Will I still get sad when something bad happens to me?
Sure.
Those are very typical questions, and those are questions which, in some cases,
Mhm.
the fact that they don't have good answers to them are obstacles to them even starting a practice
Mhm.
or taking their practice seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's that section. And then the other one, which is quite important to me, but I don't know how important it is to you, is this idea of mental health, psychology, and awakening. Sort of, again, today there was a question where somebody said, and I'll quickly just read it to you to give you an idea, because I added it in today. I've been diagnosed with OCD and schizophrenia. I'm on heavy medication and it works well. Um, Though my psyche is very damaged, these illnesses destroyed me from the inside. Doubt, confusion, and anxiety is all I know. My psychiatrist suggested meditation practice, and sort of, what can people expect from a meditation practice where mental illness is involved? How much can it
Mhm.
help? Can it cure? Can it simply ameliorate symptoms? Uh, is it something that prevents one from achieving awakening? These are, I think, really important questions that are
Right.
not well understood at this stage.
That's good. Yes. And now this is a whole lot of things that are different in many ways from what you have on the list here under mental health, psychology, and awakening.
Yes. So what I started off was talking about, first of all, your experiences again, because you said you
Yeah.
did at some stage want to talk about when you were younger that you had been committed to a psychiatric institute or something along that.
And yes, that would be good to address
Yeah,
because
and then also with your mum, that you said there were some issues there, and with your second wife, I believe, that also had some issues. So again, at that point, going back into what happened in your life before we talk about what the
Mhm.
implications are for people,
Right. Yeah.
including the fact that you mentioned you were on medication for bipolar disorder at some stage and those things.
Yeah. Well, and what's important is that there are things that, once again, there's a lot of things that people might assume that uh, that I can bring clarity. So, for example, with a psychiatric institute, was that due to a uh, a legitimate diagnosis, or at least a legitimate concern? The fact is, what it primarily had to do with was my father and his own reputation. If I was incarcerated as what they called a juvenile delinquent back in those days, and what was far more acceptable to people in my father's circle would be to have a
Mental
child
illness.
with emotional problems.
Yeah, yeah,
And so I went into a psychiatric institute.
right.
The backstory is that of course, as anyone would see, having heard some of the backstory, is that, well, I definitely had serious psychiatric problems. Was any of that recognized? No, there was no serious attempt to do anything other than make it look better, and my reaction to it was, I mean, the whole reason is that they had caught me again. If they took me back to my parents, they knew I'd run away again. They wanted to put me in a penal institution, and instead arrangements were made to put me into a psychiatric institution. My reaction to that, like, different people would set out to prove that they didn't have psychiatric problems so they could get out. My first reaction was, yeah, I'm going to tell you any bullshit I can possibly pick up from watching these other mentally ill people. I'm going to try to tell you and your doctors anything that will allow me to stay here rather than be returned to my parents.
Wow.
And so,
See, that's something you've never discussed before, and I think would be
yeah.
valuable for people to understand, because, as I said, one of the things that first crossed my mind when the scandal broke in, and I don't even like that word scandal. It seems so tawdry, and I don't think this is. I don't think it merits that label. Let's put it that way. Although some people do. Was that I thought,
Forgery?
what, huh?
I didn't quite understand what you said. It sounded like you said forgery or something.
Oh no, I said that I didn't like this label of scandal with what happened in 2019, because I don't think it merited that label.
Oh, scandal. Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things that first crossed my mind and some of my friends who are psychiatrists and psychologists was that essentially your bipolar disorder that you had mentioned that you had been diagnosed with at some point and were taking medication for, that bipolar disorder had,
Mhm.
made a comeback.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, I never was diagnosed as that. And
Okay.
this is an idea that, because of true references I had made to certain aspects of my past experience, this is what other people made into a story of
Right.
what had happened.
Yeah.
And the thing is that nobody was ever willing to give me a diagnosis of of bipolar at all. And the closest that I came was the first psychiatrist who ever wanted to address the fact that I had severe situational depression at different times in my life.
Yeah.
Said, well, because you have a couple of siblings and a parent who are bipolar, you may be susceptible to the same thing in your case, which is not uncommon, that it may be taking, it may only the depressive polar ever manifests.
Right. Yeah.
And he would not make a diagnosis on that basis. Merely, well, this is a possible connection between your mother, your sister, and your brother's bipolar disorder. That there could be a shared disposition, but he would not go beyond that.
Yeah.
And as far as being treated with bipolar medications, the only medication that he was willing to give me was trazodone in order to sleep. And indeed, I did find over the years, if I began to feel like I was seeking into a depression and simultaneously not sleeping well, that the whole process could be reversed over a period of a couple of weeks by merely taking trazodone to go to sleep.
Right. Yeah.
So any trained person is going to look at that and say, oh, well, nobody can get away with calling this person bipolar on the basis of that.
And I have not done a diagnostic interview with you or anything like that. But from my professional perspective, I don't see anything that would merit that diagnosis.
Right.
So I do think that that's important to address, because that's what a lot of people, that's another explanation that people have, pieced together and papanchad, to use that as a verb, they've elaborated on to create their own explanation for what happened. So I do think it's important for us to talk about your experience with mental illness, your experience with other people with mental illness, and then what meditation can realistically be expected to do and not do in relation to mental illness.
Right.
Yep. Fantastic.
Yes, very much so.
So then we've got that section, and then I think the last two things are, or rather, there's last two or three things, is just talking about the Eightfold Noble Path. So that I think Western psychology and pragmatic Dharma people, and some people they forget the rest of the Eightfold Noble Path, and they don't think of it as a interlocking system. So that's one thing that I want to talk about. Then this next one, I'm a little hesitant to talk about it because it's such an incendiary topic, but I think it's particularly in Western Buddhism, it's so important to talk about Buddhism and politics, and should we be involved in politics, and should Buddhists take political stands against things or for things? I want to talk about that because, I mean, there are examples like Thich Van Duc, right, who self-immolated himself as a political statement against the Roman Catholic Vietnamese government, who was persecuting Buddhists in, I think it was 1964 or some around that time.
Sure, those would be very good things to talk about, because in many cases with this, there is a gross misunderstanding. For example, there's a tendency that you get amongst Buddhists and Buddhist teachers to say that anything that is socially and politically not right, or obviously not the way it should be, that every Buddhist should embrace that. And that would be a waste of the time and what many Buddhists have to offer, to embrace every social cause of it's right or wrong. On the other hand, there may be somebody who comes to Buddhism from a background of political activism and things like that, and it may be very appropriate for them to. But these are always individual questions. They're not things you can say, well, every Buddhist should be concerned. You can only, some are very broad, and and you have to approach them from the point of view that the answers to them are very broad and cover a lot of different territory. Some of them, the nature of which are pretty focused, and depending on who you are personally as a Buddhist and your own background and situation, the answers would be very different, you know.
Yeah.
And I see you have some follow-up questions as of today here that you added. And this is, where were you doing retreat for second path? When I described my second path experience, on the one hand, um, I spoke very openly about practices, and one of the teacher having recommended certain practices that were very successful for me, and others, the other teacher had basically tried to cram me into a box that I wouldn't fit in. And I very deliberately at that time avoided saying anything by which it would be too easy for anybody to identify.
Okay.
So I'm quite willing to answer that question, and my answer won't be to say where and with what teachers, but rather to say why I tried to avoid saying anything that would allow someone to recognize where and what teachers.
Lovely.
Right?
Okay. So perhaps we could, Culadasa, while I have you here, can we take 15 minutes and just go through some of those follow-up things? Because hopefully that wouldn't take too long, or do you want to save it for next week?
Well, we can look at some of the other follow-ups quickly, just the way we did. As far as recording something for, let's do that.
Let's do that next time. Okay.
Next time.
Yeah.
Sure.
So the next issue that I really wanted why I wanted to ask you about this was one question that comes up a lot. I've heard people ask, they're saying, I'm going off to do a Goenka retreat because it's free and it's nearby and all of that. But do I have to follow the retreat instructions that are given to me? And so a lot of people say, yes, you should always follow whatever the teacher tells you. It's disrespectful to do anything else. But a lot of people want to follow TMI instructions, but don't know where they can go to do that. So that's what I wanted to talk about.
But these are really good questions to ask, and that I really would like to answer for a large audience.
So we'll start with that next week, perhaps answering those issues.
Well, which order you put these in, which ones you bring up next week, and which come up some other time, I don't know or care, whatever you feel like.
Yeah, I'll keep us on track. Do you feel I've been keeping us sort of moving along, but still on track?
Well, I do. Although sometimes in retrospect, when I go back and listen to this, I realize that I hadn't realized what you had been asking, and you allowed me to go off in some other tangent. And on the one hand, I don't mind that you let me say something else because that was worthwhile. But I also feel like, well, you really should have, re-asked the question and redirected me to what you were really trying to get at in the first place.
Okay.
Because so if you could be a little more, okay, because I answered the question differently than you meant when you asked it, get me back on track and have me answer that as well. Okay.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. So, it's
and taking things, for example, like the Goenka retreat question.
Yeah.
What you had suggested a few moments ago was totally missing the point. About practicing something else. The point here is this: people ask if they can do Goenka retreats because there are so many of them and because they're free.
Yeah.
But the point is that Goenka retreats are, nobody who's ever done a Goenka retreat or even got close to doing one can mistake the fact that the reason they offer so many retreats and offer them for free is so that they can get people to do it exactly the way Goenka said, and during the retreat, they're going to play ancient videotapes of Goenka saying it. Yeah. So you cannot do that in good moral and as an act of good virtue. Lie, because they are going to ask you if you're practicing according to Goenka, and if you tell the truth, they're going to ask you to leave the retreat immediately. So, the real thing is, should you lie? Should you steal a place in a retreat? Should you steal a retreat position? Should you steal the meals that they're offering if you know the conditions under which they're being offered?
Yeah.
No,
and
you can go ahead and ask me the exact same way that you did, so that I can say, well, that misses the whole point. This is the whole point.
Yeah, because I think, and that's the only reason I have considered many times going for a Goenka retreat, because I could afford it. It's relatively close by, and they have them regularly. But I know that I want to continue practicing the TMI instructions, and I don't feel that I could in good conscience go there and do that. But that does leave me then with a question, which is what I'll ask you, is where do I go? What do I do instead? If I want to follow TMI.
But also you asked me the question about the retreat where I attained second path, but I did what I did tell you is I end up, because I was unable to follow the retreat instructions, I did something different. Yeah. So we're not just asking a hypothetical question about somebody doing a Goenka retreat. The main reason I've never done a Goenka retreat is I couldn't do it in good faith. And the thing is that in this particular retreat, you might choose to ask me, well, how did I justify doing samatha vipassana instead of doing Mahasi style noting? And I would like to answer that question, because but the two teachers with very different approaches, and nobody had explicitly said you have to do Mahasi style noting practice. But I had also, my main reason for choosing this particular retreat with this particular teacher is if I could ever find a way to crack the nut of somehow finding if the Mahasi method could ever possibly give me any benefit at all, was to take this retreat and do my absolute best. And I did that. But then I did that and I ended up with 1 week of the retreat down and 3 weeks to go. And I got very clear with the second teacher, and obliquely so with the first teacher. I mean, the first teacher would have, he wouldn't have told me to leave the retreat or anything like that, but he would have wanted to, he was very attached to the Mahasi method. And he was indeed, the second in line to what's his name? Well, not Mahasi himself. Mahasi had passed by then, but
I forgot his name again.
The guy that wrote the book and was the head of the lineage and all that kind of stuff till he died a couple of years ago. But yeah, I took that seriously, and I made my decisions, and people could disagree with my decisions on that. But that's all right. I feel quite comfortable explaining my decisions, and I feel quite comfortable having other people disagree. But in terms of spectrums of people that willingly lie to do a Goenka retreat, others that I chose a place that I did feel comfortable, and that's the whole point. I did examine it very carefully, and I did come to a set of conclusions that I was comfortable with. And it wasn't that I did this all in a completely private, selfish thing. I also explored this with those teachers, with one directly and with the other obliquely. And in both cases, I felt like I would not be going against their ultimate intentions. That's the kind of thing I'd like to talk about. Because somebody could legitimately ask, they say, well, you're going to advise everybody else not to do a Goenka retreat for this reason, and then you're going to go ahead and do a Mahasi retreat. And it's worth me talking about that.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think some of the follow-up questions would be that some people, and save it for next time, but I'll just let you know where my thinking is on this, is that a lot of people will be in retreat, or they've said they're in retreat, and they know exactly which way to go next with their practice, but this contravenes the instructions that their teacher is giving them, or their teacher is very deliberately telling them to do something quite different. how do
Mhm.
they resolve that dilemma? So we'll talk about that next time. Yeah.
Sure. Yes, but what I'm saying is that this is a really good thing to talk about, and it is directly relevant.
Yeah.
So, and you have good in the beginning, middle, and end there. And what I do, the statement, I made that statement publicly, and what I am doing without wanting to, but I can't help it,
Mm-hmm.
I can't be honest and virtuous from my side without saying to people, if you've been practicing the same thing and you're not getting any obvious benefit from it, then you need to look into that. Stage one is you need to find out whether you're actually doing the practice properly.
Yeah.
And then step two is to try to discern whether this you are suited to this practice or not. But my bottom line is if if you're not getting a benefit from it, you should be looking for the problem, because any method of practice that gives you no result, you need to stop wasting your time with, and you need to be putting that really valuable, precious time into something that is going to work for you.
And that's exactly why I want to bring it up. There are
Yeah.
people who said they've been working with TMI for 4 years and they're in stage 2 or 3, and I asked them quite directly, have you had any benefit? What, like we go through it. I said, do you feel a little less reactive in your, are you, all sorts of aspects of their life? And some, really, it's been rare, but there have been a few people who have said, no, it's exactly the same as when I started, and that worries me. And I think worries them because they have the determination, but the method in some way or another is not working for them.
Well, I'm very sensitive to that, and I've never found a case of that where somebody has been practicing properly.
Really?
Now,
And that's
TMI,
yeah.
on the one hand, TMI may not be the best thing for them to do.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if they're not getting any benefit from it at all, my experience is 100% of the time there's no benefit at all. That what that means is there's something they're not doing properly.
Right. That and that's the conclusion I drew as well, but I wasn't sure, right? Because it's one of those dilemmas where people jump from method to method to method and they never get any real benefit because they don't stick with it long enough. But in my own case, within the first week of practice, even though it was really tiny, I could feel that something was different, that there was something good in this, even though I couldn't directly have said to you exactly what it was. I knew it was good for me. And there are some people who say, well, I've been practicing for 2 years and there's nothing good in this for me. And they just keep pushing forward with determination. So we want to avoid, as you say, them wasting precious time with something.
Sure, right. Yeah, it might mean that TMI isn't suitable for them, but it might also mean that they simply thought they were doing TMI and they haven't. And I found people who have gone through a series of different teachers and methods with the same result every time. Yeah. And if I ask them enough questions, I'll find out, well, there's some basic concept that they got completely wrong, and it's not going to matter if they can try every teacher and every meditation path in the world, and it's going to keep on failing for exact same reason.
Yeah. And I think that's important to talk about, because we as Westerners are always looking for the best method, the quickest method, and if one thing doesn't work, we'll try something else, right? And my own understanding over the years of reading and practicing and talking to you has been that all these methods are not fundamentally that different at all.
Well, some are very different, and I'd say the biggest difference between TMI and any of these other methods, whether we're talking Shinzen or anything else, is that even though most people don't realize it, TMI is an overall general structure in which you can find that, oh yeah, Shinzen fits in here and Goenka fits in here, and that I'm giving you a big picture and everybody else is giving you one little narrow path. And it's really to take a narrow path, easy to take a narrow path, try to fit it into a big picture and come up with a total mismatch.
Yeah. Okay, so I do think that that's a good question for us to spend a little bit of time on when
Sure.
we meet again.
Mhm.
Second path different, and then I wanted to ask about, how different life was between uh, first path and second path. The reason I asked this is because a lot of people said when I entered the stream, uh, 95% of my suffering was taken care of.
Mhm.
Um, and that a lot of people roll up the mat at that point, or it has been,
Mhm.
I've read that some people say a lot of people roll up the mat at that point. So what is fundamentally different between first and second path
Yeah, that's a really good thing
in
to
terms of
talk
your
about too, because
experiences, right?
I had that experience. I mean, I didn't
Yep.
roll up the mat, but it's like, wow, this is so much better than my entire life has been before. I just didn't have the same intense hair on fire motivation that I
Yeah,
did
yeah.
until second path allowed me to see clearly that, well, I'm really not that much better than I thought I was before.
Ah,
And really, what is the major breakthrough that I or anybody else has in second path is, in my case, I was seeing all kinds of things that I couldn't see from before I was a stream enterer. And now, after I've been a stream enterer long enough, I could say, there's all these dimensions of suffering that were still there that I hadn't even recognized before. I mean,
mm,
you take away the dog that's gnawing on your leg, and all of a sudden you're able to notice that you had a bunch of ants crawling over your back at the same time.
okay, right,
Right?
got it. Yeah. So look, we've now been through mainly the whole document there, and you agree that most of those things are worth spending some time on going forward.
They're
Um,
all worth
yeah,
spending some time on. And in the course of this, you probably come up with even more. And that's all right.
yeah. I am trying to not let each time that we talk become a springboard for a whole new thing. But I think generally I'm trying to keep to this structure, and this is what I think the most important things
Mhm.
are to make
Yeah,
sure we cover before we finish up these discussions.
right. Yeah.
Um,
And that's important too. I mean, from my point of view, uh, all of these things are going to bring up so many other things that it's going to be very difficult for me to distinguish what is more immediately relevant to a greater number of people, because all of these topics and all of the ones that they potentially lead to, I'm just going to say, well, these are clearly important for some people.
yeah,
But as that perspective of what's going to be most important to most people is the one
yes.
that's hard for me to come up with.
Well, let me be the one that takes on that
Sure.
aspect, and I think I have been doing that so far.
Yeah, you
Um,
have.
and
Mhm.
what I've been trying to do is, I mean, if it was just up to me and it was just this discussion between you and me, we'd probably be talking about a lot of other things because, as I said, I'm trying to do more of an ananda thing, which is
Mhm.
ask questions that are relevant to other people rather than
Right.
things that I want to know. Um, or, and not that I don't want to know these things, but there are other questions I would have asked if it was just up to me.
Yes,
Um,
right.
so don't worry about that. I will keep us on track. And by all means, if you think something is important that I'm not asking, let me know.
Sure.
And I will also be a bit more diligent about making sure that I get the answer from you
Mhm.
that I want. Because
Good.
it's just not my style when I work with people. Like if I ask them a question and they start telling me about something different, I don't generally tend to interrupt that because in psychotherapy, there's a good reason for why that person didn't want to answer that question or why it made them think about something. And I always find we tend to go back to the original question anyway. So
Yes, as a therapist, when somebody clearly doesn't want to talk about something that you ask about it, you have to respect that. But at the same time, you'll flag it as this is something that's going to be really important to talk about eventually.
eventually, exactly right. And sometimes we don't get there because I realize that they're not ready yet to
Mhm.
discuss this. And that is maybe something for another therapist 10 years down the line to address with them. But in my case, I need to be a bit more tenacious, take the more journalistic side of things but you didn't answer my question. What is X, Y, and Z, right? And I think that's partially because when I ask the question, sometimes it's very broad and you go with what you think I might want to know.
Yes, right.
Yeah. So are you enjoying watching the rewatching some of the ones that we're doing?
I am definitely enjoying them. I'm also not enjoying seeing how often I end up rambling and getting off topic, or realizing that I'm not really answering the question you asked. But those are the kind of things that I learn from, and hopefully I'll do better in future interviews as a result of them.
It's a really normal thing watching myself do, because what we do as part of our psychotherapy training is we videotape our sessions and we go back and we watch, and sometimes I sit with my head in my hands and I said, what was I saying there, what was I doing? It's quite obvious that that's not what needed to be addressed there. And that's just the benefit of being able to watch oneself on film afterwards. So
yeah, hindsight is always so much better, right?
yeah, but it's incredibly helpful to look back and go,
Mm-hmm.
to have that third person perspective and watch yourself, really helpful.
Yes, right.
So and Culadasa, I'm just going to remind you, you're not going anywhere. We need you and we love you, and it's not time yet.
Yeah, and I've got to take care of myself so that I have the time.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the only sort of, I just want to wag my finger at you for a second and just say, you know, take care of your body, take care of your mind, not just for yourself, but for all of us who really desperately need you. And I was yesterday when you messaged me and you said, oh, let's do another interview later today. I thought, no, come on, are you kidding me? Like have a rest, you know.
Yeah. Well, that is one of the challenges I have to deal with. It is the kind of person I am. It's like I've always been willing to push harder, try harder, take heroic measures, and that does have a good side, but it's got a bad side as well. You take care too.